Hello, hello. It's Pierrot back for this week, another Pierrot's Literature Show. This week, the song was La Via and Rosa, this time sung by Joseph Calleja. He's a local artist, well known worldwide for his excellent tenor voice. And the reason why we're going with a French cabaret love song like that is purely because today we're going to be reading through The French Lieutenant's Woman, quite a seminal work in terms of postmodernism because it, and today we will be reading its chapter 12 and 13. Of course, chapter 12 being still very much a Victorian realist novel, an excellently written one at the very peak of Victorian literature, and chapter 13 being the shift into postmodern thought, the um, discussion on, most importantly, discussion on what is a novel, what are the characters, and so on and so forth. Um, very excited to start this. Hello, hey yo, potato. How's the wife and kids? As we're about to get into The French Lieutenant's Woman. Chapter 12 starts with a short, a couple of short excerpts, and they are from Marx, his book Economic and Political Manuscript, 1844. In what does the alienation of labor consist? First, that the work is external to the worker, that it is not part of his nature, that consequently he does not fulfill himself in his work, but denies himself, has a feeling of misery, not of well-being. The worker therefore feels himself at home only during his leisure, whereas at work he feels homeless. The other excerpt is from Tennyson's In Memoriam, 1850. And was the day of my delight as pure and perfect as I say? Charles put his best foot forward, and thoughts of the mysterious woman behind him through the woods of Vercommons. He walked for a mile or more, until he came simultaneously to a break in the trees and the first outpost of civilization. This was a long thatched cottage, which stood slightly below his path. There were 2 or 3 meadows around it, running down to the cliffs, and just as Charles came out of the woodlands, he saw a man hoeing a herd of cows away from a low byre beside the cottage. There slipped into his mind an image, and deliciously cool bowl of milk. He had eaten nothing since the double dose of muffins. Tea and tenderness at Mrs. Tranter's called, but the bowl of milk shrieked, and was much closer at hand. He went down a steep glass slope, and knocked on the back door of the cottage. It was opened by a small barrel of a woman, her fat arms shiny with suds. Yes, he was welcome to as much milk as he could drink. The name of the place? The dairy, it seemed, was all it was called. Charles followed her into the slant-roofed room that ran the length of the rear of the cottage. It was dark, shadowy, very cool, a slate floor, and heavy with the smell of ripening cheese. A line of scalding bowls, great copper pans on wooden trestles, each with its golden crust of cream, were ranged under the cheeses, which sat roundly, like squadrons of reserve moons, on the open rafters above. Charles remembered then to have heard of the place. Its cream and butter had a local reputation. Aunt Tranter had spoken of it. He mentioned her name, and the woman who ladled the rich milk from a churn by the door into just what he had imagined, a simple blue and white china bowl, glanced at him with a smile. He was less strange and more welcome. As he was talking, or being talked to, by the woman on the grass outside the dairy, her husband came back from driving out his cows. He was a bald, fast-bearded man with a distinctly saturnine cast to his face, a Jeremiah. He gave his wife a stern look. She promptly forewent her chatter and returned indoors to her copper. The husband was evidently a taciturn man, though he spoke quickly enough when Charles asked him about how much he owed for the bowl of excellent milk. A penny, one of those charming hints of the young Victoria that still occasionally turn up in one's change, with all but the graceful head worn away by the centuries' used, past hands. Charles was about to climb back to the path, but he had hardly taken a step when a black figure appeared out of the trees above the two men. It was a girl. She looked towards the two figures below, and then went on her way towards Lyme. Charles glanced back at the dairyman, who continued to give the figure above a dooming stare. He plainly did not allow delicacy to stand in the way of prophetic judgment. "Do you know that lady?" "Aye." "Does she come this way often?" "Often enough." The dairyman continued to stare. Then he said, "And she be no lady. She be the French's Luton heir." Some moments passed before Charles grasped the meaning of that last word, and he threw an angry look at the bearded dairyman, who was a Methodist and therefore fond of calling a spade, especially when the spade was somebody else's sin. He seemed to Charles to incarnate, all the hypocritical gossips of Lyme. Charles could have believed many things of that sleeping face, but never that its owner was a whore. Glad you don't have notions to give, potato, unless you're giving a shit about this excellent piece of literature. It's wonderful how well the prose is put together here, and you'll see later on the in-depth knowledge that the author has on the nature of literature. Continuing. A few seconds later he was himself on the cart track back to Lyme. Two chalky ribbons ran between the woods that mounted inland and the tall hedge that half hid the sea. Ahead moved the black and now bonneted figure of the girl. She walked, not quickly, but with an even pace, without feminine affectation, like one used to covering long distances. Charles set up to catch up, and after 100 yards or so he came close behind her. She must have heard the sound of his nailed boots on the flint that had worn through the chalk, but she did not turn. He perceived that the coat was a little too large for her, and that the heels of her shoes were mud-stained. He hesitated a moment then, but the memory of the surly look on the dissenting dairyman's face kept Charles to his original chivalrous intention, to show the poor woman that not everybody in her world was a barbarian. "Madam!" She turned, to see him hatless, smiling, and although her expression was one of now ordinary enough surprise, once again that face had an extraordinary effect on him. It was as if after each sight of it he could not believe its effect, and had to see it again. It seemed to both envelop and reject him, as if he was a figure in a dream, both standing still and yet always receding. "I owe you two apologies. I did not know yesterday that you were Mrs. Pulteney's secretary. I fear I addressed you in a most impolite manner." She stared down the ground. "It's no matter, sir. And just now, when I was afraid lest he had been taken ill." Still without looking at him, she inclined her head and turned to walk on. "May I not accompany you, since we walk in the same direction?" She stopped, but did not turn. "I prefer to walk alone." "It was Mrs. Tranter who made me aware of my error. I am I know who you are, sir. He smiled at her timid abruptness. Then her eyes were suddenly on his, and with a kind of despair beneath the timidity. Kindly allow me to go on my way alone. His smile faltered. He bowed and stepped back. But instead of continuing on her way, she stared at the ground a moment. And please tell no one you have seen me in this place. Then, without looking at him again, she did turn and go on, almost as if she knew her request was in vain, and she regretted it as soon as uttered. Standing in the center of the road, Charles watched her black back recede. All he was left with was an after-image of those eyes. They were abnormally large, as if able to see more and suffer more, and their directness of look, he did not know it, but was the track delivery look he had received, contained the most peculiar element of rebuffal. Do not come near me, they said. Noli me tangere. He looked around, trying to imagine why she should not wish it known that she came among these innocent woods. A man, perhaps? Some assassination? But then he remembered her story. When Charles finally arrived in Broad Street, he decided to call at Mrs. Tranter's on his way to the White Lion to explain that as soon as he had bathed and changed into decent clothes, he would. The door was opened by Mary, but Mrs. Tranter chanced to pass through the hall. To be exact, deliberately came out into the hall, and insisted that he must not stand upon ceremony, and were not his clothes the best proof of his excuses? So Mary smilingly took his ash plant and his rucksack, and he was ushered into the little back drawing room, then shot with the last rays of the setting sun, where the invalid lay in a charmingly elaborate state of carmine and grey deshabille. Todd Howard, yeah, um, uh, I should probably do an episode where I should post that, but you won't be expecting it when that happens. um, I feel like an Irish navigator transported into a Queen's boudoir, complained Charles, as he kicked Ernestina's fingers in a way that showed he would in fact have made a very poor Irish navvy. She took her hand away. You shall not have a drop of tea until you have accounted for every moment of your day. He accordingly described everything that had happened to him, or almost everything, for Ernestina had now twice made it clear that the subject of the French lieutenant's woman was distasteful to her, once on the cob, and then again later at lunch afterwards, when Aunt Tranter had given Charles very much the same information as the vicar of Lyme had given Mrs. Poltenay 12 months before. But Ernestina had reprimanded her nurse aunt for boring Charles with dull tittle-tattle, and the poor woman, too often summoned for the provinciality not to be alert to it, had humbly obeyed. Charles produced the piece of amontiferous rock he had brought for Ernestina, who put down her fire shield and attempted to hold it, and could not, and forgave Charles everything for such a labor of Hercules, and then was mock angry with him for endangering life and limb. It is a most fascinating wilderness, the Undercliff. I had no idea such places existed in England. I was reminded of some of the maritime scenes of northern Portugal. Why, the man is tranced, cried Ernestina. Now confess, Charles, you haven't been beheading poor innocent rocks, but dallying with the wood nymphs. Charles showed here an accountable moment of embarrassment, which he covered with a smile. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell them about the girl. A facetious way of describing how he had come upon her entered his mind, and he had seen the sort of treachery, both to the girl's real sorrow and to himself. He knew he would have been lying if he had dismissed those two encounters lightly, and silence seemed finally less a falsehood in that trivial room. It remains to be explained why Ware Commons had appeared to evoke Sodom and Gomorrah in Mrs. Pulteney's face a fortnight before. One needs no further explanation. In truth, that was the nearest place to Lyme where people could go and not be spied on. The area had an obscure, long and mischievous legal history. It had always been considered common land until the Enclosure Acts. Then it was encroached on, as the names of the fields of the dairy, which were all stolen from it, still attest. A gentleman in one of the great houses that lie behind the undercliff performed a quiet Anschluss, with, as usual in history, the approval of his fellows in society. It is true that the more republican citizens of Lyme rose in arms, if an axe is an arm, for the gentleman had set his heart on having an arboretum in the undercliff. It came to law, and then to compromise. A right way was granted, and the rare trees stayed unmolested, but the commonage was done for. Yet there had remained locally a feeling that Ware Commons was public property. Poachers slunk in less guiltily than elsewhere after the pheasants and rabbits. One day it was discovered, horror of horrors, that a gang of gypsies had been living there, encamped in a hidden dell, for nobody knew how many months. These outcasts were promptly cast out, but the memory of their presence remained, and became entangled with that of a child who had disappeared about the same time from a nearby village. It was, forgive the pun, common knowledge that the gypsies had taken her, and thrown her into a rabbit stew, and buried her bones. Gypsies were not English, and therefore almost certain to be cannibals. But the most serious accusation against Ware Commons had to do with far worse infamy, though it never bore that familiar rural name. The cart track to the dairy and beyond of the woman's condom was a de facto lover's lane. It drew courting couples every summer. There was the pretext of a bowl of milk at the dairy, and many inviting little paths, as one returned, led up to the shielding bracken and hawthorn coverts. That running sore was bad enough. A deeper darkness still existed. There was an antediluvian tradition, much older than Shakespeare, that on Midsummer's Night young people should go with lanterns, and a fiddler, and a keg or two of cider, to a patch of turf known as Donkey's Green, in the heart of the woods, and there celebrate the solstice with dancing. Some said that after midnight more reeling than dancing took place, and the more draconian claimed that there was very little of either, but a great deal of something else. Scientific agriculture, in the form of myxomatosis, has only very recently lost us the green forever, but the custom itself lapsed in relation to the lapse in sexual mores. It is many years since anything but fox or badger cubs tumbled over Donkey's Green on Midsummer's Night, but it was not so in 1867. Indeed, only a year before, a committee of ladies, generated by Mrs. Pulteney, had pressed the civic authorities to have the track gated, fenced, and closed. But more democratic voices prevailed. The public right of way must be left sacrosanct, and there was even some disgusting sensualists among the councillors, who argued that a walk to the dairy was an innocent pleasure, and the Donkey's Green Ball no more than an annual jape. But it is sufficient to say that among the more respectable townsfolk one had only to speak of a boy or girl as one of the Ware Commons kind, to tar them for life. The boy must thenceforth be a satyr, and the girl a hedge prostitute. Sarah therefore found Miss Pulteney sitting in wait for her when she returned from her walk. On the evening Mrs. Fairley had so nobly forced herself to do her duty. I said in wait, but in state would have been a more appropriate term. Sarah appeared in the private drawing room for the evening Bible reading, and found herself as if faced with the muzzle of a cannon. It was very clear that any moment Miss Pulteney might go off, and with a very loud bang indeed. Sarah went towards the lectern in the corner of the room, with the large family Bible, not what you may think of as a family Bible, but one which, excuse me, but one from which certain inexplicable errors of taste in the Holy Writ, such as the Song of Solomon, had been piously excised, lay in its off-duty hours. But she saw that all was not well. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Pulteney?" "Something is very wrong," said the abbess. "I have been told something I can hardly believe." "To do with me?" I should never have listened to the doctor. I should have listened to the dictates of my own common sense. What have I done? I do not think you are mad at all. You are a cunning, wicked creature. You know very well what you have done. I will swear on the Bible. But Mrs. Pulteney gave her a look of indignation. "You will do nothing of the sort. This is blasphemy." Sarah came forward and stood in front of her mistress. "I must insist on knowing of what I am accused." Mrs. Pulteney told her. To her amazement, Sarah showed not the least sign of shame. "But what is the sin in walking on Ware Commons?" "The sin? You, a young woman, alone, in such a place!" "But, ma'am, it is nothing but a large wood." "I know very well what it is, and what goes on there, and the sort of person who frequents it. No one frequents it. That's why I go there, to be alone. Do you contradict me, miss? Am I not to know what I speak of?" The first simple fact was that Mrs. Pulteney had never set eyes on Ware Commons, even from a distance, since it was out of sight of any carriage road. The second simple fact is that she was an opium addict. But before you think I am wildly sacrificing plausibility to sensation, let me quickly add that she did not know it. What we call opium she called laudanum. A shrewd, if blasphemous doctor of the time called it our laudanum, since many a 19th century lady, and less, for the medicine was cheap enough, in the form of Godfrey's cordial, to help all classes get through that black night of womankind, sipped it a good deal more frequently than communion wine. It was, in short, a very near equivalent of our own age's sedative pills. Why Mrs. Pulteney should have been an inhabitant of the Victorian Valley of the Dolls we need not inquire, but it is to the point that laudanum, as Coleridge once discovered, gives vivid dreams. I cannot imagine what bosh-like picture of Ware Commons Mrs. Pulteney had built up over the years. What satanic orgies she defined behind every tree, what French abominations under every leaf. But I think we may safely say that had become the objective correlative of all that went on in her own subconscious. Her outburst reduced both herself and Sarah to silence. Having discharged, Miss Pulteney began to change her tack. "You have distressed me deeply." "But how was I to tell? I am not to go to the sea. Very well, I don't go to the sea. I wish for solitude. That is all. That is not a sin. I will not be called a sinner for that." "Have you never heard speak of Ware Commons as a place of the kind you imply?" "Never." Mrs. Pulteney looked somewhat abashed. Then, before the girl's indignation, she recalled that Sarah had not lived in Lyme until recently, and that she could, therefore, just conceivably, be ignorant of the obloquy she was inviting. Very well, but let it be plainly understood. I permit no one in my employ to go or to be seen near that place. You will confine your walks to where it is seemly. Do I make myself clear? Yes, I am to walk in the paths of righteousness. For one appalling moment Miss Pulteney thought she had been the subject of a sarcasm, but Sarah's eyes were solemnly down, as if she had been pronouncing the sentence on herself, and righteousness were synonymous with suffering. Then let us hear no more of this foolishness. I do this for your own good. Sarah murmured, I know. Then, I thank you, ma'am. No more was said. She turned to the Bible and read the passage Mrs. Pulteney had marked. It was the same one as she had chosen for that first interview. Psalm 119. Blessed are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord. Sarah read in a very subdued voice, seemingly without emotion. The old woman sat facing the dark shadows at the far end of the room. Like some pagan idol she looked, oblivious of the blood sacrifice her pitiless stone face demanded. Later that night Sarah must have been seen, though I cannot think by whom, unless a passing owl, standing at the open window of her unlit bedroom. The house was silent, and the town as well, for people went to bed by 9 in those days, before electricity and television. It was now 1 o'clock. Sarah was in her nightgown, with her hair loose, and she was staring out to sea. A distant lantern winked faintly on the black waters out towards Portland Bill, where some ship sailed towards Bridport. Sarah had seen the tiny point of light, and not given it a second thought. If you had gone closer still, you would have seen that her face was wet with silent tears. She was not standing at her window as part of her mysterious vigil for Satan's sails, but as a preliminary to jumping from it. I will not make her teeter on the window sill, or sway forward, and then collapse sobbing back onto the worn carpet of her room. We know she was alive a fortnight after this incident, and therefore she did not jump, nor were hers the sobbing, hysterical sort of tears that presage violent action, but those produced by a profound, conditional, rather than emotional, misery, slow welling, unstoppable, cleaving like blood through a bandage. Who is Sarah? Out of what shadows does she come? And with that cliffhanger, I will leave you for a short break of a minute while I go take a drink before I come and continue with the next chapter, chapter 13 of John Fowles, The French Lieutenant's Woman. Thank you very much. Hello, hello, hello. I'm back, and I believe it will be high time to continue the French Lieutenant's Woman. Um, uh, Something that just clicked as I was waiting to to uh, restart the stream is that I just up and leave without leaving some music, which is something which I find rather stupid, and I will amend my time. I do this show next week. But no matter, what is past, and now it is time to look at chapter 13. I'll be rereading the end of chapter 12 in particular, due to its importance to chapter 13. I will not make her teeter on the windowsill, or sway forward, and then collapse sobbing back onto the worn carpet of her room. We know she was alive a fortnight after this incident, and therefore she did not jump, nor were hers the sobbing, hysterical sort of tears that presage violent action, but those produced by a profound conditional rather than emotional misery, slow welling, unstoppable, creeping like blood through a bandage. Who is Sarah? Out of what shadows does she come? We are moving on to chapter 13 of The French Lieutenant's Woman, a very, very interesting postmodern contribution to the English language. It begins with this quote from Tennyson's Maud in 1850, released 1855. For the drift of the maker is dark, and Isis hid by the veil. The Isis here is the Egyptian goddess, not our good friends from the Middle East. To begin, I do not. The answer to the question is, and I will begin reading now. I do not know. The story I am telling is all imagination. These characters I create never existed outside my own mind. If I have pretended until now to know my characters' minds and innermost thoughts, it is because I am writing in, just as I have assumed some of the vocabulary and voice of, a convention universally accepted at the time of my story, that the novelist stands next to God. He may not know all, yet he tries to pretend that he does. But I live in the age of Alain Robbe-Grillet and Roland Barthes. If this is a novel, it cannot be a novel in the modern sense of the word. So perhaps I am writing a transposed autobiography. Perhaps I now live in one of the houses I have brought into the fiction. Perhaps Charles is myself disguised. Perhaps it is only a game. Modern women like Sarah exist, and I have never understood them. Or perhaps I am trying to pass off a concealed book of essays on you. Instead of chapter headings, perhaps I should have written on the horizontality of existence, the illusions of progress, the history of the novel from the Aetology of Freedom, some forgotten aspects of the Victorian age, what you will. Perhaps you suppose that a novelist has only to pull the right strings and his puppets will behave in a lifelike manner, and produce, on request, a thorough analysis of their motives and intentions. Certainly, I intended at this stage, chapter 13, unfolding of Sarah's true state of mind, to tell all, or all that matters. But I find myself suddenly like a man in the sharp spring night, watching from the lawn beneath the dim upper window in Marlborough House. I know, in the context of my book's reality, that Sarah would never have brushed away her tears and leaned down and delivered a chapter of revelation. She would instantly have turned, had she seen me there just as the old moon rose and disappeared into the interior shadows. But I am a novelist, not a man in the garden. I can follow her where I like. But possibility is not permissibility. Husbands could often murder their wives, and the reverse, and get away with it. But they don't. You may think novelists always have fixed plans through which they work. So the future predicted by chapter 1 is always inexorably the actuality of chapter 13. But novelists write for countless different reasons: for money, for fame, for reviewers, for parents, for friends, for loved ones, for vanity, for pride, for curiosity, for amusement, as skilled furniture makers enjoy making furniture, as drunkards like drinking, as judges like judging, as Sicilians like emptying a shotgun into an enemy's back. I could fill a book with reasons, and they would still all be true, though not true of all. Only one same reason is shared by all of us. We wish to create a world as real as, but other than, the world that is, or was. That is why we cannot plan. We know a world is an organism, not a machine. We also know that a genuinely created world must be independent of its creator. A planned world, a world that fully reveals its planning, is a dead world. It is only when our characters and events begin to disobey us that they begin to live. When Charles left Sarah on her cliff edge, I ordered him to walk straight back to Lyme Regime. But he did not. He gratuitously turned and went down to the dairy. Oh, but you say, come on! What I really mean is that the idea crossed my mind as I wrote that it might be more clever to have him stop and drink milk, and meet Sarah again. That's certainly one explanation of what happened, but I can only report, and I am the most reliable witness, that the idea seemed to me to come clearly from Charles, not myself. It is not only that he has begun to gain an autonomy, I must respect it, and disrespect all my quasi-divine plans for him, if I wish him to be real. In other words, to be free myself, I must give him, and Tina, and Sarah, even the abominable Mrs. Poltenay, their freedom as well. There is only one good definition of God: the freedom that allows other freedoms to exist, and I must conform to that definition. The novelist is still a god, since he creates, and not even the most aleatory avant-garde modern novel has managed to extirpate its author completely. What has changed is that we are no longer the gods of the Victorian image, omniscient and decreeing, but the new theological image, with freedom our first principle, not authority. I have disgracefully broken the illusion? No. My characters still exist, and in a reality no less, or no more, real than the one I have just broken. Fiction is woven into all, as a Greek observed some 2,500 years ago. I find this new reality, or unreality, more valid, and I would have you share my own sense that I do not fully control these creatures of my mind, any more than you control. However hard you try, however much of a latter-day Mrs. Polteney you may be, your children, colleagues, friends, or even yourself. But this is preposterous. A character is either real or imaginary. If you think that, hypocrite lecteur, I can only smile. You don't even think of your own past as quite real. You dress it up, you gild it, or blacken it, censor it, tinker with it, fictionalize it, in a word, and put it away on a shelf. Your book, your romanced autobiography. We are all in flight from the real reality, and that is the basic definition of Homo sapiens. So if you think all this unlucky, but it is chapter 13, digression has nothing to do with your time, progress, society, evolution, and all those other capitalized ghosts in the night that are rattling their chains behind the scenes of this book, I will not argue, but I shall suspect you. I report then the outward facts. That Sarah cried in the darkness, but did not kill herself. That she continued, in spite of the express prohibition, to haunt Ware Commons. In a way, therefore, she had indeed jumped, and was living in a kind of long fall, since sooner or later the news must eventually come to Mrs. Poltenay of the sinner's compounding of her sin. It is true Sarah went less often to the woods than she had become accustomed to, a deprivation at first made easy for her by the wetness of the weather those following 2 weeks. It is also true that she took some minimal precautions of a military kind. The cart track eventually ran out into a small lane, little better than the superior cart track itself, which curved down a broad cone called the Wear Valley until it joined, on the outskirts of Lyme, the main carriage road to Sidmouth and Exeter. There was a small scatter of respectable houses in Wear Valley, and was therefore a seemly place to walk. Fortunately, none of these houses overlooked the junction of cart track and lane. Once there, Sarah had merely to look around to see if she was alone. One day she set out with the intention of walking into the woods, but as in the lane she came to the track to the dairy, she saw two people come round the higher bend. She walked straight on towards them, and once around the bend, watched to make sure that the couple did not themselves take the dairy track, and then retraced her footsteps and entered her sanctuary unobserved. She risked meeting with other promenaders on the track itself, and might always have risked the dairyman and his family's eyes. But this latter danger she avoided by discovering for herself that one of the inviting paths into the bracken above the track led round, out of sight of the dairy, onto the path through the woods. This path she had invariably taken, until that afternoon, when she recklessly, as we can now realize, emerged in full view of two men. The reason was simple. She had overslept, and she knew she was late for her reading. Mrs. Poltenay was to dine at Lady Scotton's that evening, and the usual hour had been put forward to allow her to prepare for what was, in essence, if not appearance, a thunderous clash of two brontosauri, with black velvet taking the place of iron cartilage, and quotations from the Bible, the angry raging teeth, but no less dire, and no less a battle. Also, Charles's down-staring face had shocked her. She felt the speed of her fall accelerate, when the cruel ground rushes up, when the fall is from such a height. What use are precautions? And that was chapter 13, a very introspective chapter into the nature of what is a novel, what does it mean to be a novel, what does it mean to be an author, and what is, at the end of the day, a narrator. And such, I will bring this show to a close. This time our reading was 15 minutes as opposed to 10, and next week I'll try to make it so that that will fit much better than the hour time period. However, I did want to read this excellent piece, and was quite the honor to read it in front of you all. Thank you very much for being here. I'll see you all next week on Pierrot's ever-growing, uncontrollable addiction for literature show, Pierrot's Show.